A state-of-the-art Airbus A320 carrying 143 passengers and crew powers towards the runway on its final approach to Bahrain International Airport. The plane is way too fast and too high, but the pilots are in denial and they decide to press on. Moments from touchdown, when the truth becomes too obvious to ignore, the captain hauls the plane back around for another approach. But as he does so, his instruments begin to tell him something that he simply doesn't believe. What happens next is an incredible story of confusion and panic, and more than that, it's a story about what happens when two very different personalities clash in the cockpit. This is the story of Gulf Air Flight 72. It was a sweltering August afternoon in Egypt when 135 passengers and 8 crew boarded a Gulf Air Airbus A320 at Cairo International Airport. Their destination was Bahrain, in the Middle East, a 3-hour journey. On board the aircraft were a mixture of tourists and business travellers from 16 different countries, though the majority of the passengers were Egyptian and Bahraini. Accidents don't just happen out of the blue, and so it shouldn't be surprising that from the very beginning, this flight wasn't going to plan. The pilots and crew had turned up at the departure gate just 25 minutes before the flight was scheduled to leave, after they had initially been directed to the wrong gate. The crew had arrived in Cairo the previous evening and had been out late that night, having dinner, exploring the bazaars in Cairo city, and trying their hand at the hotel casino. It was after 2 a.m. by the time they'd gone to bed. As a result of all this, they were rushed when they arrived at the aircraft and eager to make up some of the lost time. But if we really want to understand what is about to happen on this evening, we need to dig deeper than just the general circumstances surrounding the flight. We need to take a look at who the pilots were. Specifically, we must examine the dynamic between them. In command of the flight was 37-year-old Ishan Shakib. Shakib was a relatively experienced pilot with almost 5,000 total flying hours, including 1,000 hours on the Airbus A320. He had joined Gulf Air as an engineer cadet over 2 decades previously and had worked his way up the ranks, reaching the final rung in the ladder as captain just 2 months previously. At this point, he had racked up just 86 hours as captain. Shakib's route to the left-hand seat had not been without its challenges, however. In a recent simulator check, which he undertook as part of his upgrade to captain, he received D ratings on 2 critical emergency maneuvers, a rejected takeoff and an engine failure after takeoff. In aviation terms, a D rating is the lowest acceptable standard for any sequence. If more than 3 unrelated sequences are graded D, the overall check ride is marked as a fail. Shakib didn't hit this threshold though, so he was not required to resit these items. Gulf Air pilots that had flown with Shakib varied in their descriptions of the man's personality. He was broadly described as responsible, knowledgeable, helpful, professional, and sharp. But at the same time, some who had flown with him described him as loud and confident to the extent that he may have bordered on overconfidence. Others described him as being somewhat boastful of his knowledge of aircraft systems. One first officer recalled that on a flight with Shakib, he had challenged the captain on his use of the engine anti-ice system. Shakib had refused to accept the first officer's explanation about the anti-ice, and after landing, when the first officer showed Shakib the appropriate reference in the airplane's manual, he refused to accept this interpretation and maintained that his use of the engine anti-ice was correct. The first officer said that during this incident, Shakib was not happy with his questioning, but that he never became angry. We'll have a closer look at this particular style and how it played out in a moment. Joining Shakib in the cockpit was a man very much his junior, 25-year-old Khalaf Al-Alawi. Al-Alawi had joined Gulf Air as a cadet pilot the previous year, going straight from piston engine training aircraft to the Airbus A320. He had built up just over 600 hours of flying time, 400 of which were on the A320. Like the captain, however, Al-Alawi's journey to the cockpit was not trouble-free. The previous year, in his initial proficiency check on the plane, he struggled with several key areas, receiving D marks on multiple aspects of the evaluation and therefore failing it. He subsequently retook this check and passed, but captains who flew with him reported that he still experienced difficulties with approaching and departing procedures at unfamiliar airports. At least on this day, he would be flying into his home base of Bahrain, which he was familiar with. But as far as this flight was concerned, the main stumbling block would not be the first officer's flying skill, but his personality. Captains who had flown with Al-Alawi had described him as disciplined and eager to learn, but also timid, meek, mild, polite, and reserved in social situations. One simulator training captain recalled that during a training session, the first officer had failed to challenge him after he had intentionally exceeded the 30-knot taxi speed limit specified in Gulf Air standard operating procedures. Looking at the contrast between these two personalities, regular viewers of this channel will see the danger emerging already, even before the flight is taken off. On one hand was a captain with thousands of hours of experience, who was known for being overconfident and at times dismissive of his junior colleagues. On the other hand was a timid new first officer who had a history of failing to challenge captains who broke SOPs. This combination of personalities is one ingredient in what some researchers have described as a lethal cocktail. At around 20 minutes to 5 that evening, that cocktail began to be stirred when Flight 72 was pushed back from the gate at Cairo. The passengers settled in for the journey, oblivious to the trouble brewing up front. In 3 hours, they would be touching down in Bahrain. The pilots started the engines, and now almost an hour late, they began their taxi out to the runway. Captain Shakib would be flying the aircraft to Bahrain, while First Officer Al-Alawi would be handling the radios. At 10 minutes to 5, the captain lined the aircraft up on the runway and set takeoff thrust. Within moments, Flight 72 was airborne and heading out east towards Bahrain. Before long, the flight had reached its cruising altitude. The passengers relaxed and took in the views as the cabin crew began their in-flight service. So far, everything appeared normal. It would be dark outside by the time they arrived in Bahrain, and many passengers retreated to views of the sunset as the night approached. The mood in the cockpit was relaxed as the pilots pulled out their tray tables to enjoy their meal, a luxury that Boeing pilots don't get to enjoy, with their control column in the way. The cockpit layout of the Airbus A320 has remained unchanged since the 1980s, and central to its design is the not-so-central placement of the side stick. Airbus pilots are trained to make small movements with this side stick, rather than the larger displacements needed with traditional control columns. That's because the side stick is not directly connected to the plane's control surfaces by cables and pulleys, like in a traditional aircraft. Rather, when the pilots move their side stick, this movement is fed to a series of computers which analyze it, process it, and then send electronic signals to move the control surfaces. This is known as fly-by-wire, and it provides an added layer of safety as well as ensuring smoother maneuvers for passenger comfort. But as we're about to see, these added protections can only do so much. Shortly after 7 o'clock that evening, the pilots began their descent towards Bahrain. They had initially been cleared by air traffic control down to an altitude of 7,000 feet. As they descended, the captain called for the approach checklist. The first officer began reading it out, and when he reached the item in the checklist about the approach briefing, the captain replied, "Confirmed." This was the first sign of trouble in the cockpit. There was, in fact, nothing confirmed about the approach briefing. The pilots hadn't carried it out. The purpose of an approach briefing is to allow the pilots to discuss any specific issues that the approach into an airport might present. It also helps to put both pilots on the same page, so they know not only what they expect to encounter during the approach, but also what the other pilot might be thinking too. Normally, the approach briefing is done during cruise flight, shortly before the descent is begun. The reason for this is that during the cruise, pilot workload is at its lowest, and therefore, it's the phase when pilots will be able to give the briefing their full attention. But on this evening, the pilots of Flight 72 continued towards their destination airport without having briefed the arrival into it. As it happened, for this approach, a briefing would have been especially useful. That's because the pilots would be flying what's known as a non-precision approach. A non-precision approach is one where pilots receive horizontal guidance towards the runway from a radio beacon, but not vertical guidance. What this meant for Flight 72 was that as the captain flew the approach, the first officer would be carefully monitoring their position and calling out altitudes and distances from his approach chart. The captain's goal would be to hit certain altitudes at certain distances from the runway. Not that you would ever want to rush an approach, but this was an approach which definitely required the crew to go slowly and carefully. And that's what makes what the pilots did next all the more perplexing. Before long, the flight had been cleared down to 3,500 feet, and the pilots had been cleared by air traffic control to make their own way to runway 12 at Bahrain. The passengers had been seated, and were told that they would be landing any minute. Out their windows, it was hard to see much, with the black sky and the dark sea blending into one another. The weather at Bahrain was good, clear skies, light winds, and a slightly more than balmy temperature of 34 degrees Celsius. All appeared normal as the plane continued its approach. During the descent, the captain entered details about the plane's approach into his flight management computer. This included the approach routing, the navigation aids at the runway, the air pressure, temperature and surface wind, and the aircraft's expected landing weight. The flight management computer then calculated the final approach speeds and the altitude and speed constraints for the approach and go-round. One of the peculiarities of Bahraini airspace was the lack of a speed limit below 10,000 feet. In most airspaces around the world, below 10,000 feet, pilots are restricted to a speed of 250 knots, or about 460 km per hour. The reason for this is that below 10,000 feet there is a much higher risk of a bird strike, and it is common for the windscreens in commercial aircraft to be tested only up to 250 knots against bird strikes. The second reason is that it is easier for ATC to control aircraft flying at lower speeds, as they have a smaller turning radius. But even though there were no speed limits, it would have been sensible for the pilots of Flight 72 to be slowing down at this point. They were getting close to the airport, and in order to land safely, they would need their speed to be slow and stable during the approach. But for some reason, the captain had removed the inbuilt speed restraint on the flight management computer. As a result, now barely a dozen miles from the airport, he was flying at a breakneck speed of 315 knots. If he didn't slow down soon, he wouldn't be able to land the aircraft. But even though the captain was the one flying the plane, it was also the first officer's job to challenge him when he was making poor decisions, as he clearly was here. The first officer didn't need thousands of hours in the Airbus to know that at this speed and this distance from the runway, a safe approach and landing would be nearly impossible. But the first officer remained silent. Flight 72 continued on towards the airport. At 25 minutes past 7, the aircraft was lined up with runway 12. The pilots would follow the signal from the radio beacon all the way to the runway threshold, with the first officer calling out altitudes and distances. All the pilots had to do now was slow down and descend. But just 7 miles from the runway, and still travelling at over 300 knots, slowing down would not be an easy task. Normally, pilots would be able to use the flaps to help them decelerate, but at their current speed, extending the flaps would damage them. But the captain had another tool at his disposal: the speed brakes. Speed brakes are panels on the upper surface of the wings, which can pop up into the airflow and help slow the plane down. The captain deployed the speed brakes and watched his airspeed indicator. This had some effect as the aircraft slowly began to decelerate, but it was still far from clear that the plane would be able to slow back to its final approach speed of 134 knots by the time it reached the runway. Aircraft the size of the A320 have plenty of momentum, and it takes a few miles for their speed to reduce appreciably. But according to Gulf Air standard operating procedures, pilots aren't allowed to wait until they get to the runway threshold to find this out. There is a check at 500 feet. If the aircraft was not within just a few knots of the final approach speed, and on the glide slope with the gear down and landing flap selected by 500 feet, the crew must fly a missed approach. Both pilots were aware of this as the plane got closer. It wasn't that they needed to be stable by the runway, they needed to be stable by 500 feet. Air traffic control now cleared Flight 72 to land. By this point, now just 5 miles from the runway, the plane should have been travelling at its final approach speed of 136 knots. However, it was still only decelerating through 220 knots. Its flaps should have been fully extended, and the gear should have been lowered, but the pilots had been travelling so fast up to this point that they hadn't been able to do this. The crew were rushed, and it was looking increasingly obvious that they weren't going to make the runway. Finally, they had slowed down enough to extend the first stage of flaps. Shortly after that, as the aircraft passed through 1500 feet, the first officer lowered the landing gear in an effort to reduce the speed further. The speed continued to decay, but it wasn't looking promising. They were still well above the final approach speed. Once the captain had the runway in sight, he disconnected the autopilot and began flying manually. He reminded the first officer that they needed to be stable by 500 feet. As the descent continued, the pilots grew increasingly anxious about their ability to make the runway. In the back, the passengers were blissfully unaware of all of this. But it wouldn't be long before it became all too clear that something had gone badly wrong. Finally, as the plane passed through 700 feet, with barely a mile to go to the runway, the captain admitted what should have been obvious for several minutes, saying, "We're not going to make it." It's worth pointing out here that at this point, all that had really gone wrong was that the pilots had been too fast during their approach. Fixing this would be easy. and even though the captain was late to admit this, he made the right call by choosing to abandon the approach. In Bahrain, for runway 12, the missed approach procedure required the pilots to continue flying on the runway heading, climb to 2,500 feet, and then to turn right to rejoin the approach path. In other words, there was nothing unclear about what the pilots needed to do. That's what makes the captain's behaviour now so puzzling. Rather than carrying out the standard procedure for a missed approach, he instructed the first officer to tell air traffic control that they would be doing a 360-degree turn to the left, known as an orbit. The idea behind this was that he could use this extra time to lose speed, and then when he re-emerged on the runway heading, he would be well set up for a second landing attempt. But this decision to carry out an orbit barely 500 feet above the ground, just a mile from the runway, was incredibly reckless. Not only was it unlikely to work, but it was highly dangerous given how close the plane was to the ground. If an orbit was to be used at all, it should have been performed at a safe altitude at a much greater distance from the airport. It was time for the first officer to step in and carry out one of the most important parts of his job, to ensure that the captain adhered to the airline's standard operating procedures. But the first officer said nothing. The captain pointed his side stick to the left, and the aircraft began rolling. As they turned away from the airport and faced out over the Persian Gulf, the sea and the dark sky blended into one. To determine his altitude, speed, and his orientation relative to the horizon, the captain needed to rely on his primary flight display, which is this instrument here. To complete his dangerous 360-degree turn, the captain would need to make small adjustments on his side stick in order to set his angle of bank and his vertical speed, and the Airbus's advanced flight control computers would ensure that the orbit was completed smoothly and steadily. But this is where, again, the captain began acting in ways which were very different from how he'd been trained. As if relying on instinct rather than on his instruments, he began making large control inputs, pulling the plane into a climb, and then pushing it back down into a descent. All he needed to do was to make small adjustments on his side stick, but instead he began stirring it around. As part of these erratic control inputs, he managed to put the plane into a bank as steep as 36 degrees, well past the 25 degrees allowed for this part of the flight. These erratic movements exerted G-forces on the aircraft which startled the passengers. The plane's motion up and down was so severe that at some points passengers were nearly lifted out of their seats, and then they were pushed into them, weighing 50% more than they did on the ground. This roller coaster motion disorientated the pilots. It pitted the senses generated by their inner ears against what their instruments were telling them. During the turn, to keep track of his position, the captain was switching his attention between his instruments and the view out the cockpit windows. This mixing of information from outside, where he could barely see anything, and inside, was a recipe for spatial disorientation. The serious consequences of spatial disorientation have been described in the book Pulling Wings from Butterflies by Captain Mike Simpkins. In this book, Simpkins highlights an academic study of 20 pilots who were licensed to fly in clear weather but not in clouds. In the study, the pilots were put into a flight simulator and then asked to fly into clouds. Every single pilot in the study crashed their aircraft. The only difference was how long it took them. For some, it took as much as 8 minutes before they crashed. Others only lasted 20 seconds. However, Captain Shakib was trained to fly by instruments. Surely such an amateur mistake wouldn't happen to him. But as he turned steeply out over the Persian Gulf, the captain began to fall prey to exactly that phenomenon. The aircraft's altitude was fluctuating wildly. At one point during the orbit, the plane was just 330 feet above the water. To give you an idea, the wingspan of an A320 is just over 100 feet. The captain was circling just 3 Airbus A320s high over water which he couldn't even see. So, in all of this insanity, where was the first officer? What was he saying to the captain? If Al-Alawi had been following the airline's SOPs, he would have spoken up multiple times already, calling out each of the many parameters which the captain was exceeding. But the first officer said nothing. His silence can be explained with reference to a spectrum, with passiveness at one end, aggressiveness at the other, and assertiveness in the middle. In an ideal scenario, pilots, by both personality and training, would be somewhere in the middle of this spectrum, able to call out errors and to stand their ground without being aggressive or overbearing. But when it came to assertiveness, the two pilots of Flight 72 existed at opposite ends of the spectrum, with the captain at the far end of assertive and the first officer solidly into passive territory. This combination was a recipe for problems in crew resource management. Not only was the first officer not playing an active role in the flight's decision making, but the captain was doing nothing to bring him into the loop. The first officer became, in the industry jargon, a resource which the captain was failing to manage. Flight 72 was now effectively operating as a single pilot crew, with the captain hell-bent on making a sharp turn back to the runway at low altitude. As the speed reduced, Shakib called for further stages of flaps, eager to have the plane set up for landing by the time he rolled out on the runway heading. Finally, the flaps were fully down. Reckless though this maneuver was, it did work to reduce the plane's speed. But with the gear down and the flaps fully extended, the aircraft was significantly less maneuverable than it had previously been. As a result, the captain reacted by being even more aggressive with the controls, wrestling the aircraft into a steeper turn than it should ever have been at this altitude. To compensate for the increase in drag from the flaps and gear, the engines were now working at high power, as the captain dragged the plane around towards the runway. Finally, Shakib levelled the wings. But there was a problem. He had only completed 3/4 of the turn. The first officer spotted the runway out to the left and pointed it out to the captain. The plane was barely 300 feet above the water at this point, nowhere near to being ready for landing after the captain's hysterical orbit. But rather than abandoning the approach, the captain pressed on. He began to turn the plane towards the runway. But his turn was too late. Flight 72 had blown through the extended runway centerline and now had to make a dramatic correction to get back on track. As well as being off the centerline, the captain was now too low, so he began to pull the nose of the plane up. But in keeping with how he'd been flying the plane up to this point, he had applied too much nose-up pitch, and then he had to push the nose back down. This tendency to be aggressive with the controls makes sense in a traditional aircraft like the Boeing 737, but in an Airbus, corrections of this magnitude are simply not needed. The wild oscillations which Flight 72 was going through were entirely a result of the captain handling the side stick as if he was flying a traditional aircraft. Not for the first time, the picture at the cockpit windscreen clearly showed that the approach was well beyond salvageable. The captain instructed the first officer to tell air traffic control that they were going around. Gulf Air procedures for a go-around in the A320 were crystal clear and straightforward. They included applying full power, pitching the nose up to 15 degrees above the horizon, and retracting one stage of flaps. But, as you might expect by this point, this is not what the captain did. He applied full power, and instead of pitching the nose up to 15 degrees, he only pitched up to 9 degrees. The first officer then retracted the flaps to the third setting, and raised the landing gear. With full power on the engines and much less drag than before, the aircraft began to accelerate rapidly. In response to this, the captain should have raised the nose further, at least to the 15 degrees required by the SOPs, and possibly more, in order to stop the speed from getting so fast that it would damage the flaps. But Captain Shakib did exactly the opposite, falling prey to a deadly illusion which he'd been trained to ignore. The plane's acceleration had pushed him back into his seat. Normally in an aircraft, there are only two ways to get pushed into your seat, either by accelerating rapidly or by pitching up. With darkness out the windows and no obvious horizon to see, the captain's brain wrongly interpreted the plane's acceleration as a pitch up. In response to this, he pitched the nose down to just 6 degrees. The plane now accelerated even faster. The captain was quickly losing control of the situation. Rather than levelling the wings, he continued turning the plane to the left. The first officer told air traffic control that they were going around, and asked the controller for vectors back for another approach. The controller instructed the crew to fly a heading of 300 degrees, roughly northwest, and to climb to 2,500 feet. But the captain was so overloaded and disoriented that he simply levelled the wings on his current heading of 040 degrees, roughly northeast. The aircraft continued accelerating until suddenly the master warning chime erupted in the cockpit and the red ECAM warning triggered. The plane was now travelling so fast that the flaps were at risk of structural damage. The first officer called speed over limit and reminded the captain that they still had flap 3 selected. The captain called for flap up, but he still didn't pitch the nose up. With the flaps now retracting, there was even less drag on the aircraft, and it began to accelerate even faster. The captain felt himself being pushed further back into his seat, which again he interpreted as the plane pitching up. He was now fully in the grip of what is known as the somatogravic illusion. Soma as in body, gravic as in gravity. His body was interpreting the plane's acceleration as a pitch up. And what the captain did as a result of this was at the same time predictable and disastrous. He pushed his side stick fully forwards. The plane pitched over and began hurtling towards the sea. The passengers were again nearly lifted out of their seats as the engines roared and the aircraft shuddered. In an Airbus, the flight control computers prevent the pilots from pitching the nose down by any more than 15 degrees, as there are basically no situations where doing this would be useful. But 15 degrees is still an incredibly steep angle, and it was more than enough to send Flight 72 into a rapid dive. The captain continued holding the side stick fully forward, reaching the full 15 degrees nose down limit, while the first officer watched on. Both pilots were fixated on the flap overspeed warning on the cockpit's central display. They were too overwhelmed to focus on anything else, including the aircraft's extreme nose-down attitude. Then, the plane's ground proximity warning system began alerting the pilots that they were descending way too fast. This warning was hard to ignore, but both pilots were now so overloaded from everything that was happening, the last-minute orbit, the go-around, the flap warnings, that they simply didn't hear this crucial warning. There just wasn't enough free space left in their minds for more information, however critical it was. The speed continued to build as the aircraft dove for the sea. The passengers had no idea what was happening. They felt all the G-forces that the pilots felt, but with little to see out the windows, they had no sense of how dire their predicament really was. Then, the computerized voice of the A320 sent out its most terrifying warning yet.
Pull up! Pull up!
The radio altimeters on the underside of the plane had detected that they were closing in rapidly on the water below. If they didn't pull up now, they would hit the water in a matter of seconds. But the pilots were so preoccupied that they simply tuned this warning out. At 7:30 that evening, with the ground proximity warning still sounding, Gulf Air Flight 72 slammed into the sea. Everyone on board died instantly. An extensive investigation began immediately after the crash, and it pinpointed poor crew resource management as one of the key causes of the accident. Incredibly, Gulf Air did not have a crew resource management training program in place at the time of the crash. It had set up an informal one in 1992, which had run until 1997 before being dropped when new management took over the airline. If a program had been in place at the time of the accident, it is likely that Captain Shakib would have involved First Officer Al-Alawi in the decision-making process as the flight neared Bahrain, and it's more likely that the First Officer would have spoken up when the captain flagrantly ignored the airline's standard operating procedures. The investigation also found that serious safety issues were pervasive in the airline, including poor adherence to SOPs among pilots, information about incidents and near crashes not being disseminated to pilots by the airline, and the airline allowing pilots to exceed their duty time limits. Its training programs were also found to be deficient, in that they did not adequately cover go-around procedures and the handling of high-stress situations. In other words, this crash did not come out of the blue. Given the abysmally poor safety culture at Gulf Air, it was simply a matter of time before something serious happened. However, as a direct result of this accident, Gulf Air has made huge changes, replacing its entire leadership and redesigning its training and procedures from the ground up. New captains must now go through a probationary period, where an observer sits in the jump seat during flights to see how they interact with first officers. There is also much more frequent training on go-rounds and GPWS warnings, and pilots can now anonymously submit safety reports. The airline also implemented a mandatory speed limit of 250 knots below 10,000 feet, to make it much harder for pilots to even get into a situation like that of Flight 72 in the first place. And importantly, the airline now has a comprehensive crew resource management training program aimed at ensuring that an accident like Gulf Air 72 never happens again. These changes have made Gulf Air a much safer airline in the years since, but the issues which caused it to crash still remain a threat to modern air travel. Technology cannot currently prevent this kind of accident. What is needed is that airlines maintain ultra-high standards of training across the board and a robust safety culture in which complacency has no place.